Hello everybody, this is Ralph Martin with RJ Quality Consulting, and in this video I want to continue with my series that I have been doing where I cover all of the clause elements of the ISO IEC 17025 standard. If you've been following this series, I've covered clauses 4, 5, 6, 7, and now I'm going on to clause 8, which is management system requirements. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. We are really going to talk about ISO 17025 Clause 8. So if you are a laboratory that is looking to possibly either prepare for a 17025 accreditation assessment externally or internally, and you want to understand Clause 8 or any of the other clause elements, you can certainly go to some of the other videos where I've covered all of the clause elements. But today we are going to focus on Clause 8, and I'm going through each of the subclauses for this particular clause element of the ISO standard. And so really for the agenda, Clause 8 is really subdivided into sections 8.1 through 8.9. And here are the agenda items. We have Clause 8.1, which talks about options, Clause 8.2, management system documentation, Clause 8.3, control of documents, 8.4, control of records, 8.5, actions to address risks and opportunities, Clause 8.6, improvement, Clause 8.7, corrective actions, 8.8, internal audits, and then finally Clause 8.9, which is management review. And in each one of these subclauses, I will also talk about what the required documentation would be if you were looking at preparing for an actual third-party audit from an accreditation body. So let's move on to section 8.1, which is talking about options. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. I do get a lot of questions from a lot of my subscribers. As many of you know, I am a certified ISO 17025 assessor for one of the largest accreditation bodies in the world. I do accreditation assessments on behalf of a accreditation body that and I oftentimes get questions, especially when it comes to the two options that you are offered within the ISO 17025 standard, and I'd like to clarify some of those questions that we get. So first of all, ISO 17025 offers two options, option A and option B. So basically in section 8.1.1 of the standard, we go right into, the laboratory shall establish, document, implement, and maintain a management system that is capable of supporting and demonstrating the consistent achievement of the requirements of this document, meaning ISO 17025, and assuring the quality of the laboratory results. In addition to meeting the clause requirements of clauses 4 to 7, the laboratory shall implement a management system in accordance with either option A or option B. And then it also points to Annex B of the standard, which kind of goes into detail of that, which we will look at. But what I want to do is, first of all, kind of explain what option A and option B actually means. So if the laboratory is under ISO 9001, in other words, is certified to the ISO 9001 quality management standard, then that laboratory would automatically be applicable to option B. If the laboratory is not ISO 9001 certified, then the laboratory would go to option A. And the reason that is because ISO 9001 in their management system is very similar to 17025 in certain areas that we will be covering in clause 8 of the standard. However, when it comes to clauses 4 through 7, it is completely different than ISO 9001. There may be a little bit of overlap, but for the most part, clauses 4 to 7 are the specific requirements to meet for the requirements for ISO 17025 when it comes to generating laboratory results, whether you are a calibration laboratory, a sampling laboratory, or a testing laboratory. So that's really the difference between the two options. If you are in option B, meaning that you are again are 9001 certified, the ISO 17025 auditor doesn't spend as much time with clause 8. That is basically the gist of the matter. So we'll move on to option A. But what I would like to do is, first of all, as you know, if you followed any of my videos, I like to go right to the standard itself so that we are all on the same page when it comes to um, what the standard requires. So if I go right to the standard and I go to what it refers to Annex B, this describes, so as you can see on my screen, I'm looking at the standard and I'm going to scroll all the way down to the appendices, which will be Annex B. This is where you don't want to take my word for it. You want to go right to what does the actual standard say about this, right? So you'll notice in Annex B that it talks about option A, option B. So basically what it's saying is due to the growth of general management systems, generally has been an increased need in adopting the requirements of ISO 9001. So option A basically says that list in option A of clause 8, list the minimum requirements for implementing a management system in a laboratory, and care has been taken to incorporate all those requirements of ISO 9001 that are relevant to the scope of the laboratory activities covered by the management system. Laboratories that comply with clauses 4 to 7 and also implement option A of clause 8 will therefore also operate generally in accordance with the principles of ISO 9001. That's what option A is. Basically for laboratories that are not certified to ISO 9001. Now, option B allows laboratories to establish and maintain a management system in accordance with the requirements of ISO 9001. Meaning that they are certified to ISO 9001, they have a management system in accordance with ISO 9001, and in a manner that supports and demonstrates the consistent fulfillment of clauses 4 to 7. So if they are ISO 9001 certified, and they also meet clauses 4 to 7 of the ISO IEC 17025 standard, then they will have met clause 8. That's what option A and option B refer to. So if you are not 9001 certified, you're going to go to option A. If you are 9001 certified, you are going to go to option B. So when you sign up for your accreditation body to become ISO 17025 accredited, your accreditation body will ask you, are you 9001 certified or not, to determine whether the auditor is going to audit you under option A or option B. So that's what that basically says. So we are going to move on with all the subclause elements starting with option A. So at a minimum requirement, section 8.1.2, as a minimum, the management system of the laboratory shall address management system documentation, control of management system documents, control of records, actions to address risk and opportunities, improvement, corrective actions, internal audits, and management review. And the appropriate subclause to those areas are shown on the slide here. And we will cover those subclause by subclause. So option B, section 8.1.3, essentially a laboratory that has established and maintains a management system in accordance with the requirements of ISO 9001 and that is capable of supporting and demonstrating the fulfillment of clauses 4 to 7 also fulfills at least the intent of the management system specified in sections 8.2 through 8.9. So that, if you are under option B, like I said, basically what will happen in practice is the auditor will spend less time in section 8. Will he spend zero time in section 8? No. He will still look at your internal audit records. He'll still look at your management review records and all of the areas of those areas, but not in detail as he would if you were under option A, essentially. So that is the difference between option A, option B. So we move on to clause 8.2, which is management system documentation. And this is a very interesting section. We start off by, and this is all under option A. If you were option B, you would stick with section 8.1. So laboratory management shall establish, document, and maintain policies and objectives for the fulfillment of the purposes of this document. And I'm going to repeat this probably more than you may want to hear, but anytime the standard refers to this document, it means ISO IEC 17025 standard. So the laboratory management shall establish, document, and maintain policies and objectives for the fulfillment of the purpose of this document and shall ensure that the policies and objectives are acknowledged and implemented at all levels of the laboratory. 8.2.2, the policies and objectives shall address the competence, impartiality, and consistent operation of the laboratory. So, documentation-wise, what does that mean? That means laboratories shall have a quality policy and have quality objectives that address impartiality and consistent operation of the laboratory, just like it says. The laboratory management shall provide evidence of this commitment to the development and implementation of the management system and to continually improve its effectiveness. And then 8.2.4, all documentation, processes, systems, records related to the fulfillment of the requirements of this document, again 17025, shall be included, referenced from, or linked to the management system. And that basically means that, for example, if you had a quality manual that links to your policies and procedures, that would be appropriately linking to the management system. So it would be a good idea to have a quality manual that points to policies and procedures. Now, in the 2017 version of ISO 17025, there is no technical requirement for a quality manual. However, in this section, you could see where a quality manual would be beneficial because although technically you don't have to have one, it would be a good idea to have one so that you meet the requirements of section 8.2.4. Otherwise, you would need separate policies and procedures for all of these requirements. It's much easier to have a quality manual that is in alignment with the clause elements of the standard, and then keep the pointing to policies and procedures that meet the requirements of quote unquote this document, meaning 17025. And 8.2.5, all personnel involved in laboratory activities shall have access to the parts of the management system documentation and related information that are applicable to their responsibilities. Now, what I'd like to do is kind of give you an idea. You might be thinking policies and objectives. Okay, standard says I have to have policies and objectives. What does that look like? What sort of objective evidence or documentation would you need to show an auditor that shows that you meet this requirement in section 8.2.1 and really 8.2.2? So let me kind of give you an idea here real quick. So first of all, it would be applicable to have a quality policy of the laboratory that addresses, just like it says here, 8.2.2, the policy and objectives shall address the competence, impartiality, and consistent operation of the laboratory. So what does that look like? I'm going to show you an example of a quality policy, quality objective document that is actually available in my documentation package. So what we'll do is we'll look at that, and looks like I sort of for it here. I had it, and then it sort of disappeared. So let me go to, here we go. I opened it and it just completely disappeared. So sorry about that. We'll open the document up again. So here's a sample document. It's actually a quality policy, quality objectives template. Here is kind of an example of a quality policy that could be tailored to your laboratory. It says client laboratory name is committed to delivering accurate, impartial, and timely laboratory results in compliance with ISO 17025. Our goal as a laboratory is to ensure confidence in our testing, calibration services by maintaining competent workforce, utilizing validated methods and operating risk-based management system that fosters continual improvement. And as you see, we are committed to impartiality and confidentiality, complying with the standard, ensuring competence of personnel, continually improving the effectiveness of the management system. And this policy is communicated, understood, and applied to all levels of the organization. You can see that this meets the requirements here where it shows you, Section 822, the policies and objectives shall address the competence, impartiality, and consistent operation of the laboratory. And the laboratory shall provide evidence of commitment to the development of improving its effectiveness. So this document would show that. Now, what would objectives look like? So on this particular document, if we go down to the quality objectives template, these are just examples of what you might have as far as quality objectives. Now, the reason this is important is when we get to section 8.9 of the standard, which are the required inputs and outputs of management review, two of the input requirements, pertain to quality objectives and quality policy. The section 8.9.2, to be specific, requires that during management review that you discuss your quality objectives and quality policy. So not only do you need them for the sake of meeting the requirements of section 8.2.2, but you also need them to meet the requirements of section 8.9.2. And when we get to that subclause, I'll show you what I mean. So here is just an example of, you want measurable quality objectives with key performance indicators. So for example, an objective might be, and these are just examples, you would want to tailor these to your specific laboratory. So objective, ensure turnaround time for test results under 48 hours. That might be 7 days, depending on the situation of your laboratory. KPI target, I don't want anything less than 95% on time generation of test results. This case is 48 hours, but in your case, it could be a week, 2 weeks, whatever is reasonable for your test results, depending on your scope. And then who's responsible, and then how often do we measure this? And then what is the current status? So this is the level at which you should have a document like this that's aligned with your quality policy that you discussed during management review, and you talk about the objectives. Did we meet them? What do we need to do in order to meet them if we didn't meet them? Things like that. So it's important that you track these quality objectives. If you don't have some sort of document, objective evidence that shows that you have quality policy and quality objectives, the auditor will give you a nonconformance in section 8.2.2 or in section 8.9.2, depending on its relevancy. So I just wanted to focus on that and ensure that you understand what the documentation requirements are for section 8.2.2. And then we'll move on to the next subclause, which is really clause 8.3, which is control of documents. So section 8.3.1, the laboratory shall control the documents, internal and external, that relate to the fulfillment of this document. Now, what is, most laboratories understand what internal documents are. Those are your policies and your procedures, your forms, anything that is, an internal document. But what's an external document? An external document would be, for example, the standard itself. That would be an external document. It might be a document that your accreditation body requires for you to adhere to, such as a policy that your accreditation body has. Typically, those policies are in alignment with International Laboratory Accreditation Committee, which is a third-party regulatory body that audits the accreditation bodies themselves, which they impose policies for their laboratories to address. So you'd be required to maintain those policies and have those in your document control system as an external document. So the laboratory shall control those documents. You need to make sure you have the latest revision, the most current revision of those documents. And it says note in the standard. In this context, documents can be policy statements, procedures, specifications, manufacturing instructions, calibration tables, charts, textbooks, posters, notices, memoranda, drawings, plans, etc. These can be on various media such as hard copy or digital, but you do have to control your documents. The laboratory shall ensure that, there's a shall statement, that documents are approved for adequacy prior to issue by authorized personnel. That means that your documents that you're using need to be approved and have an approval indication on the document. Approved by and authorized by something like that. Documents are and also ensure that documents are periodically reviewed and updated as necessary. In your document control policy, you might have something like we review our documents annually or biannually or something to that effect. But they need to be periodically reviewed, and it's up to the laboratory to define that periodicity of review. And then C, changes and the current revision status of documents are identified. So on the document, whether it's a procedure, policy, form, or what have you, you want to make sure that the current version of the document is listed, like in the footer or the header, and that there is some sort of identification of the document. Also, the relevant version of the applicable documents are available at the point of use. So if the analyst or whoever is using the document, that they have access to it either as a printed form or maybe on a shared drive or network, and that it is the most current version. And that distribution is controlled. Relevant versions and applicable documents are available at point of use, and where necessary, their distribution is controlled. Documents are uniquely identified. If it's something like POL-456 or uniquely identified with some sort of ID number reference, something like that, and that the unintended use of obsolete documents is prevented. So if you rev up a document, you change the document and it goes from rev 0 to 1, you want to make sure you obsolete rev 0 and that it's not available to be used accidentally. That's what F is. So basically, you shall ensure A through F. And then there's more. So we go to clause 8.4, control of records. Clause 8.4 is a type of records. 8.4.1, the laboratory shall establish and retain legible records to demonstrate fulfillments of the requirements in this document. So if you are using forms and a filled out form becomes a record. If you're filling out a form and it's sloppy, you can't read it, you're scribbling on it, this would not meet the requirements of section 8.4.1. When the auditor looks at your records and he can't read it, you're going to get a nonconformance in 841. Section 8.4.2, the laboratory shall implement the controls needed for the identification, storage, protection, backup, archive, retrieval, retention time, and disposal of records. That means you should have some sort of policy on records of things like how you protect them, how you back them up if they're in a computerized system, what your retention time is. That's a requirement. You have to have a defined retention time, and how you dispose of the records and what its frequency is. The laboratory shall retain records for a period consistent with its contractual obligations. So if your contract with the customer is to keep them for 7 years, then you want to be in alignment with those. You may internally say 10 years, but at least you're in alignment with 7 years that your customer requires, if that's the case. And that access to these records shall be consistent with the confidentiality commitments that we discussed in section 4.1 and 4.2 of the standard. You can look at that video if you want to get all the specifics of clause 4. And then note additional requirements regarding technical records are given in section 7.5. Clause 7.5 of the standard talks about technical records. So what do I mean? What's the difference between technical records and the type of records that we're talking about in section 8.4? Technical records are usually things like calibration records, equipment log, things that are applicable to the technical side of the laboratory. Quality records would be something that you would see in section 8.4, such as internal audit records, management review records, records for the quality management system, risk and opportunity records, opportunities for improvement. The management side of the laboratory would be pretty much defined or shown in the requirements in section 8.4, whereas technical records are defined in section 7.5. If you want to look at my video on clause 7, you're welcome to look at the clause by clause structure of that clause section. It's a pretty detailed evaluation of the clause elements of section 7. So now we get into clause 8.5, actions to address risk and opportunities. So section 8.5.1 says laboratory shall consider risk and opportunities associated with the laboratory activities in order to A, B, C, D. A, give assurance that the management system achieves its intended results. B, enhance opportunities to achieve the purpose and objectives of the laboratory. C, prevent or reduce undesired impacts and potential failures in the laboratory activities. And D, to achieve improvement. So what does this all mean? This means that you shall consider risk and opportunities, which also implies that you should be documenting these risks and opportunities on some sort of document, whether that be a spreadsheet or a Word document, something, but you need to be able to document risks and opportunities, and that they should align with sections A through D here. As we move on, section 8.5.2, the laboratory shall plan actions to address risk and opportunities and how to integrate and implement these actions into its management system and to evaluate the effectiveness of these actions. Now, just like the quality policy and objectives, risks and opportunities are also a requirement for management review inputs. It's one of the required inputs stipulated in section 8.9.2 of the section of the standard, which we'll talk about when we get to 8.9. But you're required to discuss and document your risks and opportunities within management review and within your management review meeting minutes. So what does that look like? So in my documentation package, I have a document that is, I'll share with you, that is a great way of tracking risks and opportunities. It's called a Risk and Opportunities for Improvement Register. And it's really a good document. It has a key that sort of defines the risk matrix and how they're defined. We have low, medium, high, extreme, what that means, what does acceptability mean, and it acts sort of as a work instruction, if you will. The risk matrix tab is basically broken up into two sections, pre-mitigation and post-mitigation. Pre-mitigation is, this is our risk. We haven't mitigated it yet, but here is the risk. It might be, and is that risk in pre-mitigation acceptable, probable, extreme? So we have risk severity, risk likelihood, risk level. Risk severity is broken in, there's a little pull down menu, as either being acceptable, tolerable, undesirable, or intolerable. Risk likelihood is broken up into improbable, possible, and probable. Risk level is broken into low, medium, high, extreme. So I can have a risk, for example, I'm just going to give you an example of a risk. Say the laboratory only has one balance and you do a lot of weighing, right? What would the risk be if that balance was to be inoperable today? Like if the balance fell off the bench and it broke and no longer works. Is that a risk in your laboratory? You might be thinking, we do weigh a lot of samples. We are a busy laboratory and we only have one balance. If that balance was to be inoperable, it would be a major problem within our laboratory because we do, I don't know, 50 samples a day. So I'm just pulling it out of my hat, right? So you would have a risk that I would identify that as a risk. And you might say, how severe is that if that was to happen? Well, it'd certainly be undesirable. So I'd select undesirable. What's the likelihood? Well, it's possible. And what's the risk level? Well, that could be high because, we get 50 samples a day and we would have to start telling our customers we can't meet your deadline. So we might mitigate that risk by purchasing a second balance. Or if our balance does get damaged, maybe what we'll do is we'll use the laboratory down the street. We'll send them samples to fulfill our customers' needs while we get our balance repaired. Whatever that mitigation is, and then now we'll have a new risk severity, a new risk likelihood, and a risk level. Might be, in this case, if we remedy it by buying a new balance as a backup, we might go from undesirable to acceptable. Now the risk is improbable because we have a backup balance. So the risk is now not really a big issue, and the risk level is now low, right? That would be an example of mitigating a risk. So you would want to, your laboratory, you would want to identify a few of these risks, and then as they come up, document these in this risk register, and then when you have management review, discuss the risks on this and take appropriate notes in your management review records. So that would be an example of documentation requirements showing that you meet the requirements of Section 8.5 of the standard. Now it does say, so Section 8.5.2, if you were to implement the risk register and you were to discuss them at management review, you would have met sections 852A and B. You've integrated into your management system by incorporating it into management review, and you are able to evaluate the effectiveness of these evaluations. And then it says, note, although this document specifies that the laboratory plans actions to address risks, there is no requirement for formal risk analysis for risk management or document. They're not specifying how detailed your risk analysis needs to be. So having a documented risk register certainly meets this requirement. Doesn't have to be complicated. You don't need to do a fancy FMEA type of analysis or anything like that. That's not required in the standard, but documenting your risks are. And a good way of doing that is to use a risk register like I showed you, and also to document that within your management review meeting minutes, which we'll get into when we get into clause 8.9 or subclause 8.9. So then we'll move on to section really 8.6. We'll finish risk management. So at 8.5.3, actions taken to address risk and opportunities shall be proportional to the potential impact on the validity of laboratory results. And note 1, options to address risks can include identifying and avoiding threats, taking risk in order to pursue an opportunity. Opportunities for improvement typically have a risk associated with those. Eliminating the risk source, changing the likelihood or consequences, sharing the risk, or retaining risk by informed decision. And then it says, note 2, opportunities can lead to expanding the scope of the laboratory. So if you decide to do a scope expansion, Say you're already accredited and you want to add more tests or calibrations to your scope of accreditation, that is an opportunity for improvement because it might give you more revenue generation source from your customers, but there may be a risk involved. You have to do training, you have to do all those things. But what the standard is saying here is it's hinting at the fact that if you do decide to do a scope expansion, that you want to document that as an opportunity for improvement. So you'll notice the risk register I showed you was entitled Risk and Opportunity Register. So opportunities for improvement can be documented on that risk register as well, which leads us into the next section, Clause 8.6, Improvement. So Section 8.6 is an interesting section. First of all, Section 8.6.1, the laboratory shall identify and select opportunities for improvement and implement any necessary actions. Doesn't necessarily tell you specifically how to do it, but that you need to do it. Opportunities for improvement can be identified through the review of operational procedures, the use of policies, overall objectives, internal audit, external audit results, corrective actions, management review, suggestions from personnel, risk assessment, analysis of data, and proficiency testing results. These are all examples of opportunities for improvement. Oftentimes, I recommend that labs use their internal audit process to identify opportunities for improvement. So, like for example, in your internal audit process, you might identify findings such as nonconformities, and observations or opportunities for improvement. You know, an opportunity for improvement is something like, well, technically we meet the requirements of the standard. However, I feel like we can do a better job at it and I see an opportunity for improvement. You might document that in your internal audit report, and that would be a way of documenting opportunities for improvement, hence meeting the requirements of 8.6. And also another part of this is 8.6.2, which is the laboratory shall seek feedback, both positive and negative from its customers. The feedback shall be analyzed and used to improve the management system. Examples of this type of feedback could include things like customer satisfaction surveys, communication records, and review of reports with the customers. But the idea here is the standard requires that you proactively seek feedback from your customers. Surveys would be one way. Having maybe an indicate, something on your website that says, if you have any suggestions for the improvement of the laboratory, feel free to fill this form out, something like that. But the idea is that you are proactively seeking customer feedback. That is a requirement. Most labs take the easy route and just fill out, they send their customers a survey. And the thing is, even if you send surveys and you don't get them all back, or you get very few back, which is typically the case, you still are meeting the requirement because you are proactively seeking feedback. The fact that they're not sending it back to you could mean that they are satisfied with you. Otherwise, they're not complaining. So that is a way of meeting the requirements of 8.6. Then we move on to section 8.7, which is corrective actions. So corrective actions, there's no requirement for a procedure. However, in section 7.10, there's a requirement for a non-conforming work procedure, and oftentimes that could overlap into section 8.7. So those two requirements are kind of intermingled. Move myself out of the way here. So section 8.7.1, when a nonconformity occurs, the laboratory shall, so there's a shall statement, react to the nonconformity and as applicable, take control of it, correct it, and address the consequences. They should evaluate the need for action to eliminate the cause. So you need to eliminate the cause, document the cause of the nonconformity in order that it does not recur or occur elsewhere that's in another area of the laboratory by reviewing and analyzing the nonconformity, determining the causes of the nonconformity, and determining if similar nonconformities exist or could potentially occur. So, and also implement any action needed, review the effectiveness of the corrective action taken, update risk and opportunities determined during planning if necessary, and make changes to the management system if necessary, like maybe changing a policy or procedure based on a nonconformance, and you've deemed the reason for the nonconformance is maybe the policy or procedure is not clear, we need to change it, and then we would change that policy or procedure based on the corrective action, based on the root cause of the problem. And so we move on to um, the next requirement, which is um, the records part. So first of all, corrective action shall be appropriate to the effects of the nonconformities encountered. Then the laboratory shall retain records as evidence of the nature of the nonconformity, causes and subsequent actions taken, and the results of corrective actions. So you need to keep and maintain records of your nonconformities and corrective actions on some sort of corrective action form. You might want a log where you're logging all of your corrective actions for a period of time, because again, during management review, one of the required inputs is corrective actions. And one of the things you want to do is present to management maybe a corrective action log and discuss the corrective actions and then add those to your meeting minutes. So this again goes back to management review, one of the required inputs. You can see how all these management review input requirements are related to other areas of the standard. You'll see that. That's why management review is so important. And we'll get to that when we get to section 8.9 again. I keep saying that, but it's pretty important. So then we get into the next section, which is internal audits, clause 8.8. The laboratory shall conduct internal audits at planned intervals to provide information on whether the management system conforms to the laboratory's own requirements for its management system and the requirements of this document. Again, this document meaning ISO 17025, and that it's effectively implemented. So what does this mean? That means when you do an internal audit, in a planned manner, doesn't specifically say how often you do an internal audit, but it does say that you need to do an internal audit that conforms to your own requirements, which means your laboratory, and also to this document, meaning you need to audit to each of the clause elements of the standard. There's a lot of nonconformities I see in this area as an auditor, where I'll see an internal audit and it doesn't have a checklist isn't being used where you're looking at all the clause elements of the standard. That is a requirement according to section 8.8.1a, that you audit to the clause elements of the standard, that the requirements of this document are audited, and that it is effectively implemented and maintained. That's very important. The laboratory shall plan, establish, and implement and maintain an audit program. Typically, an internal audit procedure will act as an audit program. Although the standard doesn't specifically say that you have to do an internal audit every year, it's a good idea to do one every year or based on risk, which means the number of nonconformities you typically generate. If you generate a lot of nonconformities, you might want to have internal audits more often. If you very rarely have nonconformities, it might be okay to skip a year doing an internal audit. It is totally up to you, but you do need to have a plan, and you do need to stick to that plan, and that plan does need to be documented. And you need to define the audit criteria and scope. You need to ensure that the results of the audit are reported to relevant management. Again, this is a required input to management review where you present internal audit findings and the results of the audit, and to implement appropriate corrective actions without undue delay. So you don't have an internal audit finding and don't take care of the problem. You need to take care of the problem without undue delay. And then retain records as evidence of the implementation of the audit program and the results. So as far as records, you need an internal audit plan, which your procedure could serve as your plan, and an internal audit results or a summary report of the findings, and typically a checklist that proves that you have audited all the clause elements to the standard. That's what an auditor will be looking for. So let's move on to integrating audit results into management review. So it's important that you integrate your audit results and discuss them during management review, and that you appropriately spend enough time on your internal audit during management review. Because this is the heart of your quality management system: internal audits, corrective actions, management review. Because the the way you implement your internal audit will basically be the outcome of your external audit by your accreditation body. If you generate nonconformities in your internal audit and you take care of them, and you've audited all the clause elements of the standard, you're more likely to get fewer nonconformities during your external audit. That's why it's important to discuss these at management review, so you can make some informed decisions and let upper management know the state of the quality management system, because you do have to have an internal audit records and management review records to show your external auditor. If you don't have those records, you will definitely fail the audit. So just keep that in mind. This is very important that you integrate your audit results into your management review. Now we finally get into management review. I've talked a lot about management review. It is a requirement of the standard under section 8.9. I'll move myself out of the way. So basically, the laboratory shall review its management system at planned intervals in order to ensure its continuing suitability, adequacy, effectiveness, including the stated policies and objectives related to the fulfillment of this document, meaning the standard, of course. So you need to talk about your policies and objectives. Here are the required inputs to management review. A, changes in internal and external issues that are relevant to the laboratory. You need to define your internal and external issues and talk about changes, document these. Fulfillment of objectives. You want to show your objectives, talk about it, document it. Suitability of policies and procedures. Discuss policies and procedures. Do they need to be changed? This does include your proficiency testing policy. Do you need to make revisions to it? You know you have to have a 4-year plan. You have to stick to your proficiency testing plan. Does it need adjusting? This would be a good place to talk about that. Status of actions from previous management reviews. Do you have any hanging actions that weren't completed during the last management review when we talked about the outputs, which are action items? Outcome of recent internal audits. We talked about that. We move on to F, which is corrective actions. We talked about that. Assessment of external bodies. So the assessment report that you get from your accreditation body needs to be discussed. Changes in the volume and type of work. Did the workload increase? Customer and personnel feedback, so customer complaints and maybe any employee complaints specifically from customers. K, effectiveness of any implemented improvements. Again, we talked about improvements. Are the resources adequate? Do we need more resources to meet the requirements of the standard? This is management review. You are appealing to upper management. You may need to ask for more resources. You are getting a lot of nonconformities. We really need to have such and such resource in order to do that. Results of risk identification. This would be the time you would show your risk register, talk about the risks. Outcomes of the assurance of validity of results. This is typically your proficiency testing results and other ways that you're monitoring your quality controls, maybe your upper and lower control limits, things like that. Other relevant factors such as measuring or monitoring activities and training. So those are the required inputs to management review. Here are the required outputs for management review. Management review shall record. That means you need records. The effectiveness of the management system and its processes, improvement of laboratory activities related to the fulfillment of this document, provision of required resources, any need for change. So what I'd like to do is show you an example of what management review meeting minutes would look like. So in my documentation package, I have a management review meeting minutes template that has each one of these management review inputs. You know, review the agenda. You might have some action items from the last meeting. changes in internal external issues. If there's any action items discussed, you want to write your discussion as you're presenting these, and you have a discussion, you should have a note taker that puts in your discussion points. Any actions that come out of the discussion, we want Joe to do this. He's responsible. We should have that done by this date, and what's the status? Because you're going to summarize these. Fulfillment of objectives. We might go ahead and take objectives from that document I showed you, quality objective, discuss them. If there's any discussion points that need to be documented, you would put them in the meeting minute template here. Any action items and so forth. Suitability of policies and procedures. Review of minutes from previous management review. There might be some hanging actions that weren't closed, or you might just say all actions from last management review were closed. We're good to go. Outcome of recent internal audits, corrective actions, assessment by external bodies, changes and all that, complaints. And what's really cool is at the end there is the outputs, management review outputs. And what that could be is a summary of all of those other action items and the individual inputs summarized in a table at the end. And this way, you can take the actions here, and during your next management review, that would go into the input section of discussions from previous management reviews. So the important part about management review is that you get some action items coming out of the review with responsible people associated with them, due dates, and some sort of accountability follow-up on those actions that need to be done. There's nothing worse than having a vice president or CEO say, we really need to do this, and then next year they're saying the exact same thing and nobody ever did it because nobody was assigned an action item with a due date and nobody was held accountable for it. And then all that does is frustrate the CEO and says, how come we talk about this and we never get anything done? Well, this is probably why you don't get anything done, is because you don't assign an action item, assign a responsible person, assign a due date, and follow up. So that is, I as an auditor, I find that corrective actions, internal audits, and management review really spearhead your quality management system, and that is really relevant to your management system and very important. So you want to keep that in mind. So, here are some resources that are available to you through RJ Quality Consulting. I do offer a free 45-minute consultation. I'll leave a link within the description box of this video, or if you're watching this video on my blog, I'll have a link for a free 45-minute consultation. You could talk to me about what your laboratory might need. I can help you reach your accreditation goals, whatever you want to do. I do have a certified auto-developed quality manual and procedures template that I have available that gives you all of the required documentation to meet the requirements for ISO 17025. And then I also provide a internal audit, ISO 17025 internal audit gap analysis tool that you could use. You could just download from my website, and I'll offer that link to you as well. So that is certainly available. And that is really it for this video. If you have any questions, feel free to comment on the bottom of the video or on this blog post if you're reading the blog post. And if you missed any of the other clause element videos that I've done, I will also leave a link to one blog article that lists all of the videos for each of the clauses 4 through 8. And you'll have a detailed step-by-step, clause-by-clause description of the ISO IEC 17025 2017 version of the standard, which is the most current version of the standard. This is Ralph Martin signing off. You make it a great day.